Hello, I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives and welcome to another special presentation. I'm so fortunate to have Harley Schlanger join me on a basically bi-weekly basis as often as we can. And so here we go with another edition of Harley and Me, the name I attached to the show a couple years ago, just thinking of Bob Marley, I mean of the book Marley and Me, which again, resonates with me because of my particular love of the musician Bob Marley. So anyway, that was a little bit too much of an explanation, but
Could have been Me and My Harley.
okay, me and my Harley, huh?
That's another song I think I heard one time.
Well, Harley, so glad to have you back. And how are you doing today? Welcome to McDuff Lives.
I'm doing pretty well. I'm a little bit angry in the last couple of days because we've been having another problem with Facebook, which I'm sure you're not surprised about. But, just as I built the audience back up on the daily views to over 30,000, yesterday it was posted probably on Venus or something because there are only about 150 views of my update. And so far today, there are only a few hundred. So obviously, whoever has their finger on the algorithms playing around with it a lot. And it's really important because what's happened in the last couple of days is we've had an open admission on behalf of NATO and the European Union, and especially the British, that this is going to be a permanent war, no matter what happens to the Ukrainians. And after the fall of Bakhmut, which I hear Zelensky is still protesting that it's not yet fallen, but after that, what does he have to offer? What is it that he's offering them? He's offering them a land and a small number of people to commit suicide to try to degrade Russia. And so this is what happened at the G7 meeting of all places, John. Were you at all shocked that they're so brain dead they would hold a meeting planning a war that could become nuclear war in Hiroshima? I mean, doesn't that seem a little bit clueless to you?
I don't think
arrogant.
I don't think it's clueless. Yeah, I think it's arrogant and not arrogant in the minds of the participants themselves, arrogant in the power behind the scenes that can conduct these puppets to do such a horrific thing. It's horrific to go to Hiroshima and declare yourselves in favor of permanent war, which is, I mean, what is the what do we think when Zelensky comes back and the very first thing he does is launches some half-cocked invasion of Russia just to grab the headlines away from the Russian involvement, victory in the town formerly known as Bakhmut. And I think the new name or the original name is Artemyevsk or something. I'm not going to say it right, but at any rate, that it is a watershed change in the politics, the geographical boundaries that are most likely not going to change unless there is a widening of the war.
And that's what we're going to see. I mean, I think what happened with the F-16 decision. Now, this is somewhat ambiguous still because at the Hiroshima meeting, they all said, well, we're going to train them to use F-16s. Well, why would you do that if you're not going to provide them F-16s? And some countries are starting to say, well, that's going to happen. Now then Sullivan came out and said, oh, but we're telling them they must not use them to attack Russia. Well, they just sent people in to attack Russia, it appears, in the last 24 hours. You really think Zelensky's going to hold back the F-16s? Now, then you have this, I guess it's a EU defense ministers meeting today in Brussels. And what are they discussing? Who's going to provide the F-16s? And then Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador to the United States, asked a relevant question. How are you going to fly the F-16s when you don't have the capability on the ground in Ukraine to do it? You don't have the air capability to do it. You don't have the training, the tracking. Are these going to be flying from NATO countries? And if so, What does that mean? In other words, this will be a definitive statement of NATO's in the war against Russia. And then you have, starting June 12th, the Air Defense 23, which will be the largest NATO maneuver in history. And it's going to be practicing intercepting Russian jets. It's going to be practicing going up and down the border, covering the Black Sea. And the possibility, even NATO officials are saying they're going to have to be very careful to avoid any crossing of red lines that could lead to accidents or crashes in midair with the Russians. So they're about as provocative as they can be. So I think this is a turning point, and it's a turning point in two ways. It's becoming clear Ukraine can't fight back based on any Ukrainian capability. So they're willing to risk the rest of their population. That is, Zelensky and NATO are willing to do that. Will the Ukrainians put up with it? And will the people in the NATO countries accept this? So far they have. So it becomes very dangerous. And I think you're right. It is somewhat of a watershed moment. And it's typified by the fact that they would do this kind of planning in Hiroshima, when this was the location of a dirty trick run by the British and Harry Truman to when they knew that the Japanese were already entering into negotiations to surrender. And yet in August of 1945, they dropped 2 atom bombs on 2 Japanese cities. So the implications are, we did it before, we can do it again. And I think in Joe Biden's mind, this would not be a problem. So that's why it's so dangerous.
We are facing the possibility of a total war, and we're probably have already begun what is going to be a permanent war in Eastern Europe, and God forbid extending into Russia itself. But if we take that seriously, then we have to consider how we can prevent it. And certainly the countries that are on the border between the West and the East must be just horrified by the idea of a total war between the West and Russia, because they're going to be the battlefield. Can you tell me what reactions we see from Hungary, Poland, the Baltic states, the other countries that would be in the firing line?
Well, there are a couple of things. Today, an RAF, Royal Air Force battalion, is doing maneuvers in Estonia, which is one of the Baltic countries. And it's interesting. Seymour Hersh wrote an article, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, maybe 3 days ago, where he said that he has heard that Poland and Estonia were warning of the danger of the war continuing, that NATO is not prepared for a war with Russia, and yet that seems to be what's happening. And he wrote and said Poland is sending messages to the Ukrainians saying, now's the time to negotiate. And this is also coming from some of the sources you have from defense-related think tanks and others who are saying that, well, the offensive is not going to make any more difference. In fact, if the offensive is launched and failed, it will put Ukraine in a worse situation. So now's the time to negotiate to cut the losses. But the fact that the RAF is conducting maneuvers today in Estonia, and that the Poles are the ones who are likely to provide the first F-16s, shows that there's a real schizophrenia around this. On the one hand, they want to look tough. They want to look as though they're standing up for their rights. On the other hand, they're behind the scenes saying, look, maybe this is the time to negotiate. So I think there's a growing awareness that this could go bad very quickly, or go to worse very quickly. And then you look at the assessment now coming out about what happened in Bakhmut. This was now the question that's being asked by some: was it really Zelensky's decision to keep the Ukrainian forces in there, or was this forced on him by NATO? Now, the Douglas McGregor had a very interesting point months ago, which he just reiterated yesterday, which is that the strategy of the Russians was to keep one pathway open so Ukrainian soldiers could come into Bakhmut so they could wipe them out. And the losses for Ukraine are quite extraordinary in Bakhmut. They claim that they've killed more Russians than they lost, which hardly anyone believes. But meanwhile, expending so much of your force for to create a new generation of martyrs is clinically insane. And at some point, the people of Ukraine, if they had any ability to reflect on this, which they don't because their media is shut down, the opposition media is shut down, opposition political parties are shut down, but there's got to be a lot of anger there about the way this has gone. And there doesn't seem to be a way out. The Chinese, the Lula from Brazil, now a group of African nations, are talking to Zelensky and to Russia, and they're saying, look, let's settle this. Let's have a negotiated settlement. And Zelensky says, yes, 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 we'll negotiate as soon as Russia is driven out. So you see the permanent war side of this thing. Now, if you have something else that you want to bring up on that, I want to go to something that Sir Richard Dearloffe said at a speech to the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom, which shows the extent to which the British are committed to fighting this as a permanent war. But was there anything more you wanted to bring up on the immediate question of this permanent war?
No, I had a couple of comments, but I was going to go towards Britain myself with the next question. So let's go ahead with Dearlove.
Well, for those who don't know him, Sir Richard Dearlove, who is now in some circles being called Sir Richard Strangelove for obvious reasons, was head of MI6 from 1999 to 2004. He's the one who had his team draft what was called the Dodgy Dossier under direction of then Prime Minister Tony Blair, which came up with a completely fraudulent case for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and also, sometimes forgotten, that it was Dearloffe's reporting that said that Iraq was connected to al-Qaeda terrorists, which, of course, anyone with a brain in their head knows was a complete fraud. Saddam was fighting them. So in any case, Dearloffe was also the person who vouched for Steele, Christopher Steele, who had another dodgy dossier, which was used for Russiagate. And he's emerged recently. He was the one who was sent to Kiev to talk with Zelensky after the Zelensky President Xi phone call, where Xi and Zelensky had a fairly lengthy talk. And what I'm told is Zelensky held to his hardline position. You've got to get Russia to stop. You've got to tell them to pull out, give us back our territory, then we'll negotiate. And Xi just told him that's not going to happen. But if you're willing to accept neutral status and accepting the fact that you're losing some of the territory you claim, we'll help you rebuild. And Zelensky rejected that. Zelensky rejected the Pope's offer. So in this circumstance, Richard Dearloffe was sent to Kiev to make sure that Zelensky stayed with that. And Dearloffe came back and said, we're all committed to the idea of no negotiations until there's been a Ukrainian victory. Now, the day after he came back, he spoke at a UK National Conservatism conference. And he started out by saying that he misses the Cold War because there was something about the Cold War period that provided cohesion and motivation to the people of the United Kingdom. And he said, it seems to me, since the end of the Cold War, we have lost our way. Without the essential threat to our way of life that was a constant feature of the Cold War, we've lost cohesion and motivation, and especially our self-confidence. And he talked about how standing up to the Soviet Union gave the British people a sense of self-confidence. And then he said, looking back over time, it never occurred to me that I was not on the side of angels. So in other words, everything we did was justified. Now, he said, that's changed today because of the amplification of minority views by social media. And this is interesting. Besides calling for permanent war, he's calling for censorship. He said the social media allow, quote, mainline political and social debate to become seriously distorted by fringe movements, unquote. Now, what does he mean by a fringe movement? A movement which says we shouldn't have war, we shouldn't continue this proxy war? Well, that's exactly what he means, because he said that those who ignore the peace conditions laid down by President Zelensky are doing the work of our foremost enemies. Basically, the line that comes from the hardcore neo-Nazis: if you don't support us, you're a Putin puppet and an information terrorist. And then he concluded his speech by talking about the ultimate goal must be, quote, nothing less than revolutionary change in Russia, unquote, by which he then later talked about regime change and getting rid of Putin. So here's a highly placed source in the United Kingdom, essentially saying permanent war, destroy Russia, bring down Putin. And this war is good for our country because it gives us a mission. And so I think this makes very clear everything that we've been saying about the military-industrial complex plus, that they're committed to this because it's not just for the purposes of making money through wartime, but because that's what they want to use to streamline society to fit their needs, namely no social media, censorship, no opposition, and ultimately degrading any country that would have the strength to stand up against this. So I think this Dearlove speech is quite significant given the overall picture that we're looking at.
I think we're hearing a lot of, well, for example, the incursion or, mini invasion of Russia yesterday. A lot of things that are geared at pumping up the investors behind this Ukraine venture.
Yeah.
And bringing the F-16s. I mean, it might sound exciting to people that don't know what you were just explaining about the difficulties of bringing in an entirely new airplane jet technology into a country that hasn't got the proper bases. They probably have runway problems and all kinds of things that are.
So the runways have been degraded by Russian attacks. That was one of the first things they did.
I guess they would have done that, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
So there you go. It sounds to me like it's just more, investor relations. Saying, "Hey, we're doing this. Look what we're doing in Estonia. Look how we're going to apply the most provocative NATO exercises ever." And see, we're going to Moscow. We're going to Moscow. Don't worry.
And John, here's something interesting on that. The head of military intelligence for Ukraine, who's this guy who keeps saying there are 6 Putin body doubles and Putin is dying of cancer and Russia's losing and they're running out of weapons. He's a real image maker. He's one of the people who pumped up Zelensky. He made the following point. He said, the Russians lied about hitting one of the anti-missile, one of the Patriot systems. We shot down 6 Kinzhal missiles, the hypersonic missiles. We're proving that the Russian military is all hype. It really has no power. We're standing up and proving to the world the superiority of American technology. And it almost sounded as though he was saying, this is an advertisement. This war, at least what he's presenting as the great Ukrainian victories, is an advertisement for American defense sector and trying to sell the Patriot missile to every other country that might feel threatened in a possible war. So this is where you see on the one side playing into the greed of the military industrial complex. But the other issue continues to show up which is the de-dollarization, the move away from the unipolar order, and the fact that many, many countries are stepping forward now saying they're not going to go along with this. And one thing about this was that when Biden was in Hiroshima, he was supposed to go to Australia next for this Quad meeting. They're doing everything they can to try to get India away from Russia, working with the Australia, British, United States, the so-called Quad. It's not working. Modi's in Australia, and they're playing this up as a big deal for Australia. He's in Australia to talk to the large Indian diaspora there. And supposedly he's raised a ton of money for his election campaign in India, while saying very little against Russia, very little in support of the US and the United Kingdom. So the West is putting its own narrative out there, and unfortunately, except for what you can find on the internet, it's not being challenged, the narrative.
The other issue that we've been touching upon is the suppression of free speech. And, you know, I, of course, have had a lot of that with my YouTube channels being taken down in the entirety, you know, for something that they felt was violative of their narrative. And so now we have in Germany, where you are, we have a trial going on against a doctor. His name is Bhakdi, Bhakdi, and his crime appears to be sedition. He's charged with the crime of sedition, which is similar to treason. And it all emanates about comments that he made in the context of his opinion, which varies from the narrative of the mRNA vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that this kind of a trial is very similar to a trial that would have gone on in the Soviet Union.
A show trial, yeah.
Show trial to suppress somebody's content, to not let it get out there, just like YouTube doesn't want to hear any competing narratives about the so-called pandemic. So in Germany, you spoke about Ukraine having no free speech whatsoever. What is your observation, and do you think that Germany is suppressing free speech in its media?
Oh, absolutely. But the way they do it is that the mainstream media in Germany is at least as tightly controlled as it is in the United States and the United Kingdom. Just as an example, a very prominent American historian who used to serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee, he's written a number of books, traveled the world. He wrote an article that is a very powerful article saying that the NATO eastward movement is equivalent to Hitler's idea of Lebensraum. That is, Hitler's excuse for moving east was to get more living space for the German people. And that this was really a cover for moving into the Baku region of Russia and grabbing the oil for war, but also to break up the Soviet Union and grab the raw materials. But they called it Lebensraum. So he wrote an article saying that the NATO eastward expansion, including with the Germans playing a leading role in providing weapons, shows that the whole West has now adopted this idea of Hitler, of Lebensraum. And he sent it to German publishers. And not only did he get no one interested in publishing it, but one person who was somewhat friendly towards him said, "You're lucky they're not publishing it because it might lead to the publication being shut down and a trial against you." So, and this was from a German newspaper editor who was somewhat sympathetic to the article. You had during the victory in Europe commemoration on May 9th, May 10th, Scholz basically said that today the Germans are the ones who are defending against the Hitler policy of, I'm sorry, just 1 second,
Sure.
defending against the Hitler policy of Putin. And Schultz said, anyone who doesn't know that is spreading misinformation. So that was from the chancellor. Then you have this Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, who's certifiably crazy, the green foreign minister, who's the biggest war hawk of all. But then you have Habeck, the green, who's the economics minister, who's insisting, in fact, he's pushing a law that not only can there be no new gas appliances in homes, but any home in Germany that has gas appliances has to replace it by 2025. And this will cost tens of thousands of euros for every family that has these traditional gas, electricity and heating and so on. And when someone tried to argue against that in the parliament, he threw a fit, and the media just said that the person who was objecting to it was supporting having the world heat up and climate change kill us all off. So the narrative here is very heavily defended by the media and by the government. And ironically, the people who in the past were the ones who argued that their voices had to be heard, the Greens, are the ones now suppressing it the hardest. At least in the US, the Green movement is somewhat split. Some of it's totally in bed with Biden, but some of them are breaking away and joining the peace movement. So even though the censorship is strong in the United States, doesn't match what's happening here in Germany.
And that's frightening because, if you don't hear both sides, you're liable to support the war. And that's what they did in the American Civil War. In the South, it was forbidden to bring any northern newspapers into the South during the Civil War. That made sure that nobody's point of view was heard except for that of the rebels, the governments of the Confederacy. And that's what's going on in Europe, and that's what's going on in the United States.
Yeah.
What horrors are going on behind the scenes that we don't know about because they're being suppressed by our government and our media working.
Well, then you see it with the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. campaign, where the only thing that some of the media will talk with him about is the question of the anti-vax issue. And they cut him off when he talks about Ukraine, when he talks about the corporate control over government. They cut him off. They don't let him say it. They censor it. And, as he pointed out the other day in an interview, I think with Crystal Ball, he said, look, in my opening campaign statement, which was almost 2 hours, he said, I had one paragraph on COVID. To me, that's an issue of the past. I don't want to see shutdowns again. I don't want to see those kind of policies again. But that's not what I'm campaigning on. And she said, yes, but you must answer these questions. And that's part of the way they control things. On Trump, whatever Trump says, they want to talk to him about January 6th. And of course, their narrative of January 6th. So this is the triumph of what George Orwell wrote about in 1984. And, how do you fight this kind of suppression? You do everything you can to get an alternative picture out, because I think, I've told you this before, John, the statement that I like from Sholem Aleichem, from the Yiddish Renaissance, he said, the truth never dies, but it lives a miserable life. But our job is to make sure that it stays alive. And I think that's underestimated in importance by even the people who are speaking out against the narrative. Many of them have surrendered. You can't beat them. You can't win.
Your poetic reference called to mind a vision of the eternal flame at JFK's grave in Arlington Cemetery. And that idea of eternal hope, eternal promise of the future will never die. It's
Yeah.
it's coming back now with the possibility that Bobby Jr. can really claim the presidency. Have you got an opinion on whether he, first of all, do you believe that that I don't want to put you in a spot and say, have you chosen a candidate yet? But how do you feel about his candidacy? Are you feeling good about it, or are you concerned about what may be actually behind the scenes?
Well, we're looking into a lot of things about who he's working with, what he's done in the past. But our view basically is that what he's raising in a very courageous way is opening a pathway to overcome the power of the so-called deep state or the secret government. And in that sense, we're not supporting his candidacy as a candidacy. We're supporting the issues that he's bringing up and trying to deepen them, because I don't think he'll succeed if he keeps it as narrow as he has. Now, by saying that, when I say narrow, the Kennedy assassination is a very big issue, an important issue, and especially for people who were alive at the time when John F. Kennedy was killed, the older generation. And for him to bring it up after all these years, and for him being a Kennedy to bring it up, is extremely important. Now, what we're doing is we're circulating a statement issued by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which embeds what RFK is doing in something that's, I think, absolutely essential to be a companion to his statements, which is on June 10th, it will be the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's speech at American University. And what John Kennedy said at American University was profound. And the book by James Douglas, the JFK and the Unspeakable, makes this point over and over and over, that what Kennedy expressed in that speech was something that Americans should be hearing all the time. JFK said, we abhor communism. We don't like communist system because it takes away our freedoms. But we honor the Russian people for their advances in science, their advances in economics. And he said, no nation paid a higher price than the Russians did in World War II. And we honor that when we were allies. And then he goes into this discussion of commonality, common interests, and this idea that they have concerns about their security just as we do. Now, remember, this is just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what Kennedy came to realize is that as much as we felt threatened by the Soviet missiles being placed in Cuba, Khrushchev and his people felt threatened by the Jupiter missiles placed in Turkey. And that was the deal that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though it wasn't known at the time. You take out your missiles, and then quietly in a few months, we'll take out our missiles. And this idea of recognizing legitimate security interests of the other, that's what Kennedy said in that American University speech. And he ended it very poetically when he said, for in the final analysis, we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all have hopes for our children's future, and we are all mortal. And what Helga said in quoting that in the statement, and if people want to get the statement, you can find it on the schillerinstitute.com website. What she said is that we would like to bring America back to an approach to foreign policy coherent with what John Kennedy expressed in that speech. And that's what, if Robert F. Kennedy does that in his campaign and can avoid being trapped into the traps that the media are setting up for him, this will resonate with the American people, especially when we have a president who's stumbling and bumbling us into a nuclear war. So in that sense, we see this as a courageous, bold move on his part, limited in a number of aspects, which I can talk about in a moment, but nevertheless an important one which can be used to force the kind of honest, open public debate that we haven't had since the assassination of President Kennedy. So that's my way of saying we're not going to support him as a candidate. We're going to try and make the issues that he's raising change the country. And in that sense, create a presidential campaign where we don't have advertising executives profiling people and narrower identity politics, but actually have a serious adult discussion about what should our future look like.
I'd like to ask you a kind of a more broad question, if I may, and it goes back to this issue of what the Club of Rome and the urge toward curbing population. And I'm gonna read an excerpt from EIR from May 25th of 2009. It's you can read it, folks, on LaRouchePub.com. And it's May 25th, 2009. The London Sunday Times, May 24th issue exposed the genocide agenda of a top secret meeting of 14 of the world's richest people on May the 5th, 2009. In its story, quote, "Billionaire Club in Bid to Curb Population Growth" by John Harlow. American statesman Lyndon LaRouche called the meeting, quote, "a kind of confession to mass murderous intent against the world's population."
Mm-hmm.
The meeting was convened on the initiative of the man deemed by Forbes to be the world's richest, Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, which has brainwashed millions of youth through Facebook. Warren Buffett, ranked number 2 by Forbes, who has pledged $31 billion, the bulk of his fortune, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And David Rockefeller. Rockefeller arranged for the meeting to be held at the home of the president of the private Rockefeller University in New York City, Sir Paul Nurse. One insider dared to call its participants, quote, "the good club." Beside the three conveners, the meeting was attended by New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, drug promoter George Soros, Peter G. Peterson, the genocidal advocate for government budget cuts, who co-founded the Blackstone Group, former hedge fund manager Julian Robertson, and on and on and on with more Rockefellers, Ted Turner, Oprah Winfrey, etc. Now, this is a charge by Lyndon LaRouche himself that there is a group of elites that are putting together a program in 2009 for genocide. And I submit to you that we are now encountering the genocide program, whether it is the war in Ukraine, the assaults on our health, the horrible narratives that we're being fed, the constant fear and terror that's being propagated everywhere in the world. I think we are now in the midst of that plan being executed. Well, what are your comments on that?
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I think you're absolutely right. And, I think, well, that article is an important article. That's nothing different than what Lynn was saying back in 1969 and 1970 when he was taking on the Club of Rome, the Meadows and Forrester report on the limits to growth. What he saw at the beginning of the environmentalist movement from the early 60s through the end of the 60s was a new form of Malthusianism. And he identified it as coming from the British monarchy, in particular, Lord Bertrand Russell, who, you may not know this, or maybe you have read this in our publications. In 1947, Russell was advocating a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union because he said it would be better to destroy them now before they have nuclear weapons than once they get them. And it was in an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that he made that argument.
Yeah.
So LaRouche had identified in his own mind Russell as a key figure in this. And Russell was, of course, a promoter of Malthusianism. His idea of philosophy was essentially that you can't really know the truth. You have to live within a certain framework, which is defined by limitations of knowledge and limitations of raw materials. the classic British Malthusian view. And what you find then in the 60s and 70s is the coalescence of the leading financial figures. And you mentioned some of the names that were at that 2009 meeting, the Rockefellers, Mayor Bloomberg, Bill Gates. These are people who completely bought into this. At the time, the coordination was being done by the British monarchy, Prince Philip, and by the Rockefeller family. John D. Rockefeller was a leading proponent of population reduction through eugenics. I mean, the Harriman family funded the Eugenics Record Office in the 1920s, talking about limiting the inferior peoples. Everything that we hear from the Nazis in the late 1930s and then the Wannsee Project and so on, that was all in New York. The Harrimans and the Bushes. Prescott Bush was one of the leading promoters in the U.S. Senate of Planned Parenthood. And that goes back to his support and funding with Roland Harriman through their bank of the Hitler movement in the 1930s. So this is what LaRouche was looking at, and this is what we were talking about. We were called wild extremists and crazy conspiracy theorists back before that was a really popular word in the 1970s, precisely because we identified these people as philosophical adherents to this outlook. Not just that they intended to do it, but they intended to do it because philosophically they believed in their own eugenic superiority, genetic superiority. And they believed that culling the herd was necessary to keep the useless eaters from overrunning the planet. And so this has been a consistent, coherent theme from LaRouche. This is something I've been talking about for it's 50 years now since I met LaRouche. And what we've seen is that in some ways they're more open today, but they do it through different covers, like the global warming. All of a sudden we're told, well, it won't be global warming, it might be global cooling. Well, we were talking about that in the 70s, that these things are pretexts for reducing world population. And how do they benefit from that? That's the question a lot of people don't get. I mean, what's in it for the Rockefellers? What's in it for the Rothschilds? What's in it for the Aurelio Pache of the Club of Rome and the European oligarchy? Well, it's what Josep Borrell, the foreign minister of the European Community, said. He said, we have a garden in Europe. The rest of the world is a jungle. We don't want the people from the jungle coming in and ruining our garden. Now, what he didn't add is that, but we do want to go and steal their resources for our benefit. And that's what it's always been. It's a new form of the old British Empire idea that you find the people who are most willing to commit murder of their own populations on your behalf and elevate them. This is how the British Empire worked. The BBC just did a story today about an Indian family in Trinidad that was brought there initially because there was no longer slavery in the British Empire, but the Indian family was brought there to oversee the black population in a quasi-slave labor system. And this is what the global South is rebelling against. So I think it's important that it's useful you found that article. If people go through the archives of the Executive Intelligence Review or the writings of Lyndon LaRouche, you'll find over and over and over him coming back to this theme of the difference between man and the animal, which is something that the oligarchy doesn't accept. They basically think that they're special, but that the rest of the human beings are like a herd of wild animals that has to be culled. And this is what Russell said. Russell said, in keeping down population, he said, war has been, what did he say? Has not predictable, but war has been unsuccessful in limiting the population growth. And then he said, a plague every generation or two would allow those of us to procreate freely who are better. So he was explicit. This was in, I think, his book on science and society from 1953. So that's how Lynn was tracking it. And then, they just had a Bilderberg meeting in a hotel in Portugal. And what was the main subject? The Ukraine war, artificial intelligence, and the central bank digital currencies. And people like Gates were there, and the usual suspects, except the media wasn't allowed in.
So, and thank you. And your 50 years of observation, excuse me, pardon me, of 50 years of observation of this, I think speaks, in support of my own concerns that Bill Gates, with his power as the richest man in the world at the time, and perhaps still is, running the policy of the World Health Organization, to which he is one of the hugest contributors. And it calls to mind a very famous quote of his from a TED Talk back, I think, 2009. And it says, quote, "If we do a really good job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that world population by 10 or 15%, unquote." Now, think of the irony of considering lowering the population a really great job done with vaccines. Vaccines are supposed to increase health, not decrease it. And now, people like David Icke have been warning for years that they're going to use vaccines to accomplish their genocidal mission. Am I wrong to consider that what Dr. Bhakdi is saying, what Bobby Kennedy's book, The Real Dr. Fauci is saying, what Dr. Malone is saying, and so many others, is worthy of consideration on a public forum? Why is this stuff being suppressed? And is this not something that really needs a thorough examination?
Well, that's exactly the point, John. What I would argue is that some of the people who oppose Fauci and oppose the health system make valid points. But the essential issue is that we have to have an open, full debate on this, open public debate, as opposed to just recrimination. Now, people like Gates and people who are trying to reduce the population, that's clear, that's a problem. But I think to lump the whole thing into the vaccination question does a disservice, because there are doctors and scientists and others who have allowed the world population to grow because they have made discoveries that are useful. So I don't think this is where you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's why I would say we need a full, open debate on this, including some of the issues raised by Kennedy in his book on Fauci. And I'm not defending Fauci. I think that the net effect of the last 30 years of healthcare policy in the United States has been to reduce the protection and the life expectancy of the average person born in America today. And it's probably intentional. For example, the change in the hospital programs from what we used to have, where we had a standard of how many beds per 10,000 people, that was obliterated. We've obliterated whole aspects of the what was considered public health. The medical profession is being destroyed, and it's being destroyed in part through artificial intelligence and computers. So we need a whole debate, and not just limiting it to vaccines, but to the question of what is the real interest for a healthy population. And you start with things like clean water. You start with things like a healthy diet, and not just, this is why I come back to the John F. Kennedy speech in June 63. He said, we want peace, not just for Americans, but for all men and women, and not just for our time, but for all time. this idea that we have a capability in the United States, if it's not under the control of private corporations, to make discoveries that will benefit the whole world. Now, I just want to come back to one other point here. We can come back to this in a second, but one other point. The one problem I see with what RFK Jr. is bringing up on the Kennedy assassination is that John Kennedy was not the only one assassinated by this assassination bureau. And this is a point you know quite well. You look at the attempts against de Gaulle, the murder of Maté, the murder of Lumumba. This was an international assassination bureau. And it intersects what we're just talking about with the British royal family and the Bill Gates and the Rockefellers and others. So we've got to have a broad picture of who's actually defending humanity and who's promoting policies that will reduce the population. And I think that's got to be the starting point.
Well, just for folks' information, I did a show this week on General Lemnitzer and his involvement in Operation Gladio, which is exactly what Harley was just talking about. And I recommend you listen to it. My wife puts them up now. She does one a week of our shows on podcasts. So it's called McDuff Lives Podcast. And if you Google that, you can just listen to it instead of having to watch it here on Rumble or YouTube or Facebook. Harley, I have to say, I think that the vaccine issue is far more important than you are giving it in your opinion, because the risk is very high. If this really is a ticking time bomb, then we've got to stop it. I speak of mRNA injections, and if it's not, then fine. Then let's all make sure that we stand down and stop our being concerned about it. But the more I look at it, the more I'm concerned, and I would urge that everybody take a hard look at what's going on with this trial with Dr.
And John,
and what's behind it.
What I said is we do need a rigorous public debate that's not controlled by corporations or government bureaucracies that were set up to defend the corporations, and that's what's needed. And at this point, I think it is important to recognize that the science is not fully clear on either side yet. And that's partly the nature of what happens. Oftentimes we find out later on things that we were doing were bad and some of the things we were doing were good. But the question is, can you speed it up so you know early enough? And when something's in the hands of people who say they want to reduce the world's population, that ought to be a starting point for rejecting what they're proposing.
Well, I'm going to leave it right there. Thank you very much, Harley. And it's been a great discussion for me. I appreciate your thoughts on all of these varied things and your experience and expertise in so many subjects and it helped me. And as you said, the Executive Intelligence Review, you find it at larougepub.com. Just flip through it. I mean, there's thousands of incredible essays by wonderful writers that will enlighten us and help us understand the past so that we can avoid those same mistakes. Those that do not study history are doomed to repeat it, as somebody famous once said. Thank you, Harley.
Okay, John. See you in a couple of weeks.
All right. Bye, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow night with the trio, Mark Kulak, David Underdown, and myself. Bye now.